Let's take a closer look at this developing story, and we're joined by Ken Medlock, who is with the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University. Ken, thanks for joining us. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Okay, China has said time and again there are no winners in a trade war, but it appears we could be headed down that avenue. China announcing tariffs and export restrictions. So it's really no surprise that China reacted this way, is it?
No, not at all. Anytime there are punitive measures taken in discourse around international trade, it's natural to expect the counterparty to levy retaliatory measures, and that's exactly what we've seen. But I think it's important to characterize this entire discussion sort of in the frame that it's actually been used. The Trump administration is actually engaging in economic statecraft here, using an economic lever to try to influence other outcomes. At least that is what has been stated. Now, of course, we know Trump has been very vocal about trade deficits and a desire to rectify those. It's debatable whether or not those are bad in the first place, but without a doubt, if you look at the press statements by the White House and the executive order itself, this is very clearly a measure of economic statecraft meant to impact immigration and drug trafficking.
Okay, Ken, I want to pick up on what you just talked about, because Trump has said time and again, other nations are taking advantage of the United States, and they still do when the United States has a trade deficit with that nation. Let's talk more about that. Why does he say that? And from many economists I've heard, it's not out of the ordinary to have a trade deficit if you don't have manufacturing in your country or if you're looking for cheaper items from other nations.
No, and in point of fact, a trade deficit is not necessarily a bad thing economically. That's something that I think seems to have been lost in a lot of discussion. I was actually joking with some colleagues earlier today that we need to reinvigorate teaching around international trade in our universities in this country, because there seems to be this misunderstanding about what a trade deficit is. I mean, typically, if you run a trade deficit, there's also a capital account that's indicating you've got foreign direct or capital flows are positive, and so that's generally good for investment. So it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Well, some could say you could start at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue with those educational efforts. But let's talk about the effects that tariffs by both the United States and China are going to have on consumers. Which areas do you think the average citizens are likely to feel the pain and feel it quickly? And will it be more intense for American consumers and American companies?
Yeah, that's a great question. It literally depends on the commodity and the good that's being traded, because when you look at an international trade context, one thing you have to understand is that when a tariff is levied, it's effectively a tax. It's a tax on an import. And so when you levy that tax, you then get into a classic, what we call tax incidence question: who bears the burden of the tax? And it entirely depends on what the substitution opportunities are. So for example, and I'll kind of lean into Canada because this came up in a conversation earlier today, but when you look at Canadian exports of crude oil, they really only have one outlet, and that is actually to the United States, into refining capacity in the Midwest and down into the Gulf Coast, which means that if a tariff is actually implemented on Canadian crude, the Canadian producer will bear the brunt of the tariff, and it will have virtually no impact on the price of crude oil in the lower 48. Similar thing can be said with regard to the imposition of tariffs on different Chinese-produced goods. It really depends on what the substitution opportunities are, and that will ultimately determine what the impact on consumers is. So when you get into certain commodities where there's limited opportunity to substitute to other things, then yeah, it's going to hit the American consumer pretty hard. But in other cases where you'll just reshuffle the deck on a broad sort of fungible, globally traded commodity space, then it's not going to have that big of an impact.
Well, think back, because China did impose a number of economic stimulus packages in the latter half of 2024, measures that really seem to have a positive impact in that nation. So what could this tariff battle do to China's economy and really the ongoing global economy, considering we're talking about the two largest economies on Earth?
Absolutely. I mean, that's actually what's a little bit frightening and quite frankly injects a massive amount of uncertainty to the global economic landscape, is the fact that you're talking about the two largest economies in the world. And the last thing anybody wants, I think, is an all-out trade war. We saw the outcome of the first Trump administration. The disputes around tariffs and trade between China and the U.S. There were some estimates that have been published that indicate that the Chinese economy fared about 3 times worse than the U.S. economy as a result of that. I would hazard a guess that is likely going to be the case this time if something similar does occur. But of course, the devil's in the details. So we'll have to see exactly what tariffs are levied and how they actually manifest. So.
You know, Ken, earlier you were talking about why Trump is doing this, and many believe that Trump is using, quote, the threat of tariffs to win concessions from various nations. He did win with Colombia, Mexico, Canada, and now the EU has said it wants to come to the table to avoid this. So does he believe that tariffs are going to help fill government coffers? Do you think he understands that's not the way tariffs work, or do you think he's using this as a plan to say, and I don't mean to be silly about it, I really wonder this, or do you think he's just using it as a tool to get what he wants?
I think it's a tool. If you look at to get what he wants, if you look at his actions, both in the first time in office and this time, you know, he tends to sort of levy a threat as a means to begin a negotiation, and I don't see this really as any different. So I would be surprised if there wasn't a very robust discussion between the Chinese, between Xi and Trump at some point over the next week, and an agreement is reached on a way to sort of avoid a trade war. So yeah. I typically take that, take that to mean, basically he's levying a threat in order to stimulate a conversation.
Ken, real quick, 15 seconds. Is this a dangerous game of chicken?
It is, because the consequences associated with the major trade war between the two of the world's largest economies can have reverberations that extend beyond just U.S. borders.